Well, Mark Few has got a lot of decisions that he's going to have to make to put this roster together next season. Joining me today is Tristan Freeman of Busting Brackets. He's joining me to attempt to break down what the rotation and starting lineup might look like for the Gonzaga Bulldogs in Spokane next season, right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Don't go away.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. And it has been a busy week in Gonzaga land the last couple of days. Here to break it all down and look at some potential lineups for the Zags next season is Tristan Freeman. Tristan's a former guest of the show, managing editor at Busting Brackets, phenomenal college basketball blog through Fansided. Tristan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, appreciate you having me back on, Andy. A whole lot to talk about for Gonzaga.
Yeah, I was kind of just looking at trying to get some guests back on the show in June. Thought, maybe it'll be a little bit of a quiet time, and really glad I reached out to you when I did, because we got a lot to cover. Probably more than 30 minutes worth of content after what was an insanely busy week for the Zags. The first thing that I really wanted to ask you about, we kind of looked at the offseason for Gonzaga when it first started. They missed out on a couple targets. Anthony Black was a big one. Sky Clark thought maybe he'd transfer to Gonzaga or decommit and come to Gonzaga. He chose not to. Missed out on a few other transfers. There was some nerves, some nervous energy in Spokane and in the surrounding area. Now, of course, within a matter of 48 hours, Rasir Bolton, Julian Strawther, Drew Timme, all decide to come back to Spokane. 3 out of 5 starters, the most they were going to get back. How surprised were you to see all 3 of those guys make the decision to return to Spokane?
Very surprised if you look at all 3. I think throughout the offseason, there were cases where all 3 of them were at best 50-50. And there were also just moments where it felt like any of them could leave. Like after the season, it felt like Bolton was ready to move on after 4 years of college ball. Strawther was someone that you assume could come back, but then during the NBA draft process, he was the guy that looked like a potential first-round pick. There was rumors of potential promise for him, so it looked like he could have gone. And then with Timme, he was one of those that still had a senior year, but he could have been like Kofi Coburn, where was just ready to go pro. That even though his draft stock was never going to, increase, he could have just been ready to just start his professional career. So there was a legit chance that all 3 of them could have been gone. Like, I think if you were the most optimistic fan, 2 of them could have returned, and you wouldn't have known which 2. But then to find out on literally at the midnight of deadline, all 3 of them would come back. It was an incredible day for Zag fans.
Absolutely wild. I think, as you said, my best case scenario was I think they're getting 2 of these 3 guys back. I think best case scenario, with no disrespect to Bolton, who's a great player, but I thought if they get Timme back, if they get Strawther back, I think they can, the guard rotation they have, this was even before Malachi Smith, is going to be fine without Bolton. But then he made the decision to come back, and I thought, okay, well, there's no way Julian's going to come back then. If Bolton's coming back, there's not enough room. Of course, Bolton comes back. Of course, Timme follows suit. Now you got a very loaded team. And like we said, a couple days later, not even, I think basically a day later, it was confirmed that Malachi Smith out of Chattanooga was coming to Spokane, a player that had been rumored to come to Gonzaga for nearly a full week before it was made official. What can you tell me about this kid and how he might fit in Mark Few's program?
Yeah, he was a SoCon Player of the Year at Chattanooga. He started out at Wright State, and no one thought when he transferred over to Chattanooga that he would turn into one of the best mid-major guards in the country. An elite scorer, averaged 20 a game, had 36 against Murray State, played well against the top competition, was easily the best guard in the SoCon, and led them to the NCAA tournament in a one-bid league. He struggled against Illinois in the first round NCAA tournament, but Trent Frazier, Illini guard, was one of the best defenders. And it showed, the lack of support and talent that that Malachi Smith had at Chattanooga. Now he comes to Gonzaga, where he could arguably be the fourth best player, and it still not be a slight to him, because now he's going to have Timme, Strawther, Bolton, and five-star players to work with. So an incredible addition for him, especially considering that he was originally the backup plan, assuming that either Bolton or Strawther leaves, and yet you're somehow able to add him, which just gives you another playmaking guard, can run the point, can play off guard, a good shooter. It's one of the best pickups that technically you can argue Gonzaga didn't even need, but still was able to land.
Yeah, it's funny. We've seen so many guards kind of come through Gonzaga through the transfer portal, and one kind of constant we've seen with a lot of them, and Bolton was the most recent example to really hit this point home, is the efficiency numbers improve so dramatically when they come to Gonzaga. And I think there's probably a lot of factors there. I think the most notable one is that most of these guys were, like Malachi Smith, the number one player on their team. So they're facing the opposing team's best defense. They've been game planning against this particular player. Ryan Woolridge was probably the closest example as a smaller mid-major guy who was very dominant for multiple years in college, came to Gonzaga, put up much, much improved efficiency numbers. Do you see Malachi Smith was a pretty efficient shooter, particularly from beyond the arc, despite being the best player on his team? Do you see potentially some improvement there as well, or how he's kind of going to fit in to this offense?
Yeah, I think partly is because he won't be on the ball all the time. Like you could argue that he was the point guard for Chattanooga, but in a way he was sort of just the lead guard that just had the ball in his hands. And sometimes he would pass, sometimes he would shoot with it. This time, there's a chance, depending on how the lineups work out, that he'll be the 3 with Bolton as the 2 and Nolan Hickman as the starting point guard. Well, what I think is important with Malachi Smith is that he gives Mark Few that insurance point guard in case Hickman's not ready, because he's going to be a true sophomore. Gonzaga's best team is when the point guard runs the show, like with Andrew Nembhard, Nigel Williams-Goss, Kevin Pangos. Is Hickman ready to be that guy next year? Because with Timme back, they're in a win-now scenario. And they can't afford Hickman to go through ups and downs. So if he's not ready, you can slide Malachi Smith in there and be the point guard, and knowing that he doesn't have to do it all. He can just throw it down low, throw it on the wing. So it's different options for Mark Few to work with. So we could see him at the 3, at the 1, potentially as a 6-man in case Salas has a breakout year. That's always an option. So a lot of things you can do with Malachi Smith, which is what I think Mark Few really wanted to get in a transfer guard this offseason.
Absolutely. And I want to talk more about those lineups and how some of those positions might shake out. We're going to come back and talk about that in a later segment. But before we do that, Tristan, the big question, I'm just going to ask it point blank. I know that rosters are not finalized for every team, although the majority of the big moves have probably already happened. At this point, if you were ranking a top 25, would Gonzaga be the number 1 team in the country?
I would, and I think 2 other decisions that occurred during draft weeks helped make that. Arkansas is losing Jalen Williams was big for them. Had he stayed, I think they would have been the consensus number 1 team. But now they got a lot of transfer forwards and young guards. Questions there. Houston brings back Marcus Sasser, who's one of the best guards in the country, but they didn't get a starting center yet. It was rumored to be Kenneth Lofton. Had he stayed, he probably could have gone to Houston. That doesn't happen. They have questions there. And in North Carolina, it's the other team. They still haven't landed that transfer power forward to replace Brady Manick now that Matthew Meyer is going to Illinois. If they get Pete Nance, who is a rumored target, there's going to be the legitimate debate as whether or not the Tar Heels should be number 1, because Pete Nance could have been a Gonzaga Bulldog had Timme stayed in the draft. That's another caveat to what was a crazy deadline day. I think if that happens, you could put Tar Heels 1, but Gonzaga, they just have too much. Considering that Nolan Hickman is the projected weakness on the lineup right now when you're looking at 2 through 4, and they have Efton Reid as a backup big man, and we could talk about what his role could potentially be. Gonzaga is just too stacked from a roster standpoint not to be number 1 currently.
Well, you teased perfectly into the next segment, Tristan. We're going to talk front court in segment 2. We're going to talk about what the Zags are going to do with Efton Reid, how things could potentially shake out, why Julian Strawther might end up playing a slightly different position next year. Before we get there, though, I want to tell you all about Built Bar. Summer is coming, and with the summer, you're going to need some food on the go. Built Bars are the perfect snack to take with you on family vacations. Throw them in your bags, in your kids' backpacks. Make sure that everyone has a bar so you are fueled for your summer adventures. The best part about Built Bars, they're healthy and delicious. No more sacrificing delicious food for health. With Built Bar, you can have both. Have you tried the Built Puffs yet? We are going crazy for the Puffs. They come in crazy flavors like banana cream pie and even churro. Who doesn't want a protein bar that tastes like a churro? And they're only 140 calories. Sign me up. If that's not enough flavor for you, then you might want to try the Mixed Box. The Mixed Box comes with 12 flavors of bars and puffs. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Go to Built.com to get all your favorites. Banana cream pie, raspberry, double chocolate, and so many more. They are all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, and get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags, still here joined by Tristan Freeman of Busting Brackets. Tristan, I saw a recent article of yours at Busting Brackets going over your predictions for Gonzaga's rotation. I gotta say, I enjoyed seeing your starting lineup because it is the same starting lineup that I projected for this team. Of course, I might change my mind. You might change your mind. There's a lot of time between now and the first game of the season, but I saw you wrote it out as Nolan Hickman, Rasir Bolton, Malachi Smith, Julian Strawther, and Drew Timme. I want to start with the front court because Julian Strawther was not a 4 last year. He played primarily on the wing. He played the 3 spot. The Zags had 2 traditional bigs, of course, with Chet Holmgren in the mix, no longer a part of the team. But do you see things, how do you see it shaking out with Strawther playing some more minutes at the 4? Is that something you feel very confident is going to happen? And how do you think it's going to work out for this team?
I do feel confident because I think it's not even much about Strawther as it is about Timme and maximizing what he can do at the 5. Like there's few bigs that can guard him one-on-one. So having 4 shooters and 4 capable scorers, that's ideal. And I think as good a player as Anton Watson is with his versatility and his defense, him and Timme is just not a great offensive pairing together in the front court because Watson can't shoot.
Yeah.
And that would be the same thing in any hypothetical Efton Reid and Timme pairings. So to have a guy who can shoot 40% from 3 like Strawther at the 4, it basically would create the same thing with Corey Kispert when he was at the 4 with Timme. And those lineups were unstoppable. And while the Ayayi, Jalen Suggs and Nembhard lineup might be better than what would be Malachi Smith, Rasir Bolton, and Nolan Hickman, you still want that offensive potential because Timme giving you 20 a game just makes it so much easier for the other guards, and it would take pressure off of Hickman. Yep. And in a case where you want to put your best players on the floor, assuming Hickman and Salas has their little breakout sophomore campaigns, they're gonna be on the court a lot. Yeah. And if that's the case, someone like Watson, who's a veteran, but we've seen his ceiling offensively, maybe his minutes is going to be impacted. Yeah. It's because someone's is going to have to be. It's either going to be one of the sophomores or Watson. And with Strawther's versatility and his ability to rebound, because he is a good rebounder, I think that might be the ideal lineup or sort of the quote-unquote depth lineup Gonzaga uses a lot.
So you touched on one of the more fascinating elements to me, which is obviously Drew Timme returning is good universally for the Zags. It's good for college basketball, but it creates a bit of an interesting dynamic in the front court. I agree 100% that Drew Timme in a lineup with primarily shooters and guys who can space the floor is obviously ideal because him operating in the low post with plenty of room has been unstoppable for 3 years. Nobody has stopped that. So why not give him as much room as possible to operate? But it does make it challenging to play him alongside Anton Watson. It does make him a little challenging to play alongside Efton Reid. So now you have a situation where you have these 2 likely backup bigs. I suppose there's a situation where either of those guys could start, but it's tough because if each of those guys needs to play 20 minutes per night, I'm just not sure where those minutes are going to come from. I believe your predictions had Watson at around 18 and Reid a little bit lower than that. Is that just because there's some challenges of getting all those guys on the floor at the same time?
Yeah, I think Watson's career average is around 18. And
Yeah.
I think if Strawther, because I had him playing a little bit after 3 as well, in case for some bigger lineups. So I think Watson can play his minutes because his defense and passing ability is important, especially not knowing what Hickman and Smith can do. Having an extra passer on the court is key. But Reid is the big loser from that because he's a center. And whenever Timme's on the court, he's not going to be. So I had Reid round 13 because Timmy's average is around 26, 27. When you include, blowouts that limit his minutes, and then when he plays 33, 34 for the big games, it's going to be tough for Efton Reid. But I think the one case you can make for if you're a coaching staff is, hey, you're going to be on a team in the culture that's likely going to be number one in the preseason. They'll definitely be number one during league play because they're going to run through the WCC. You get to go to the tournament, at least a Sweet 16 appearance, Final Four. You get to develop and work with Drew Timme, which would be a great way to prepare. And then when he's gone, the front court's yours next year. Like that I think would be a better scenario than going to Virginia Tech, getting 25 minutes as a starter, but probably be on a bubble team. So I think you wouldn't look at it as like a redshirt year, but in a way it kind of is where you get limited minutes, but get to experience a lot of winning development. And then the year after, it'll be your time on a big stage.
And I think that's why Efton Reid was kind of the perfect fit for Gonzaga when he first committed, because the other guys that they were looking at, they were looking at Broome out of Morehead State. They were looking at Amac out of Utah Valley. Both those guys were going to go to a situation where they were going to play 30 minutes per night and develop their stuff to be potential NBA players. Both those guys were borderline NBA players this season. So you can understand why those guys were like, well, I don't want to go into a situation where a potential player of the year candidate might all of a sudden block me. Whereas for Efton Reid, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And yeah, I imagine that he was probably pretty excited about getting to start for this team, and now seeing his minutes dramatically decreased most likely is unfortunate. But for me, a player who, one of the things Reid needs to work on is interior post defense. I don't know how you could possibly get better at post defense except guarding Drew Timme every single day in practice. That's going to make you so much better as a post defensive player. I think this is all good news for Efton Reid. I understand that there's probably people who are thinking, oh, he's frustrated. This is not what he was expecting. Why didn't he go somewhere else? I see this as nothing but positive, especially when you look at Gonzaga's history of developing bigs behind the scenes.
Yeah, and one thing the coaching staff does do is they're honest with the transfers. Like, I'm pretty sure Coach Few did not tell him Drew Timme is gone. Like, I think he said, look, it's probably 50-50. He could come back. He could leave. What are you going to do? And considering we've heard nothing from Reid and his family up to this point, you're assuming that it's okay. So I don't think you have to worry about any disgruntlement. I don't think there's any issues with that. Same thing with Malachi Smith. I mean, he made his decision afterwards and still committed. Bolton, I'm sure that considering that Smith took his visit during that time, there was a lot of talk about what everyone could do. So I think everyone's on the same page based on the results, regardless of what everyone's minutes or roles going to be. I think everyone is bought into what could be a special season for all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple guys in the front court rotation that you laid out in the article here that pretty much don't show up at all. And I'm in agreement with you, unfortunately, that it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of minutes on a game-by-game basis for Ben Gregg, a top 30 prospect in his class, or Kaden Perry, a top 60 prospect in his class, or Braden Huff, the newcomer, who's a 4-star recruit, Mr. Illinois, out of the city of Chicago. You got 3 very young, very talented big men. And it doesn't look like those guys are going to sniff the floor. Are you surprised by that? Do you think that that's just another one of those things where Gonzaga is just going to develop those guys behind the scenes, or what's the situation there?
No, I think Gonzaga's reached a point where we're on the same level as Duke or Kentucky in terms of there's going to be top 50, top 100 guys that just aren't going to be on the court because the entire roster is filled with top 100 guys. And we know that unless you're Leonard Hamilton, you're not playing 10, 12 guys. So there's just going to be people who's going to be, stuck in the backcourt. And this was the rare case where guys came back. Had they left, there would have been minutes potentially available. But it's sort of a case where, hey, it's great that they're coming back because I'm going to be on a top 5 team. But now my minutes is going to be limited. And they're going to have to make decisions do they stick it out one more year on the bench and then wait for them to go? But
Mhm.
then there's always going to be the case where, and Mark Few has shown it, he's going to get transfers. He is not going to have a young roster. He's in win now mode, and the top free agents are clearly interested in Gonzaga. So they're going to have to show either in practice or wherever that they can be contributors for Gonzaga. Otherwise, they're going to have to hit the portal, and that's just a part of college basketball these days. In the 8-man rotation, the guys 9 through 13 is going to have to decide, and it doesn't make them bad players. It doesn't mean that they can't play. Umar Balo is a great example of it. He ended up being a great rotation player in Arizona. Sometimes that's just how it's just going to have to work out.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the 2020-2021 team and Corey Kispert playing the 4 and how offensively dynamic and talented that team was, but that team had one fairly significant flaw, which showed itself in the championship game against Baylor. A couple flaws in that game, but one of the big ones was rim protection. And obviously Chet Holmgren helped really shore that up last season in Spokane, but he's gone. And this year's roster has a very similar makeup to that team from 2 years ago. Is rim protection an area that you think is going to be a concern for the Zags this season?
Yeah, it definitely will. When Drew Timme is your starting center, that's going to be a concern because he's just not elite in that area or pick and roll protection. But that's just it's going to be what you have to deal with. Gonzaga is probably going to be the number one scoring team again. Like there's a whole bunch of teams in the top 25 that you look at on paper wondering, can they shoot? Can they score more than 60 points? Every single team, if you look at people's top 25 rankings, have clear flaws.
Yeah.
So as long as you're Gonzaga and you don't deal with a team that has elite, scoring big men, then that should be okay. But like always, the tournament's going to be matchup based. You just have to hope you can survive that. Also hope that your guards don't, shoot 4-25 from deep, like what happened against Arkansas. You could argue that Timme's interior defense was not the issue why they lost to Arkansas, because Timme did fine. It was the fact that the guards couldn't shoot. If the guards could shoot, then things would have been fine. So sometimes it's not even about what your weakness is. It's just a matter of execution and the guys being consistent for 6 games in March.
All right, Tristan, I want to switch over to talk about the backcourt. We could probably talk more about the front court if we wanted to, but there's a lot of intrigue going on in this backcourt. We kind of already touched on Julian potentially playing some more minutes at the 4, which kind of leaves that small forward spot open. It looks like it's going to be a lot of 3-guard lineups this upcoming season, which has been a bread and butter for the Zags. Almost every one of their very successful seasons, they played a lot of 3-guard lineups. It's not uncommon at all. You kind of have Malachi Smith being more of that 3 role, the kind of the bigger guard. Is there a reason that you think he kind of fits more into that role?
Well, it's more so I just think that Rasir Bolton is the clear shooting guard. Like he shot 47% from 3. He's a smaller guard. He's not an elite rebounder. That's him. So Malachi Smith, he can rebound, although at the SoCon level. So that'll be something to work on. But ideally in the 3-guard lineups, you have 2 capable ball handlers and a shooter, no matter which way it works. So even though it's just like the small forward to 3 spot, you could just call it, 2 combo guards and a shooter. That's where Smith would be, and that's also where Hunter Salas will be, assuming he comes off the bench. That's where you could put Dominick Harris there as well. You just various lineups. It don't really matter where they're labeled, but as long as you have a ball handler and a shooter and a defender, that's going to be important.
Yeah, I think you talked a little bit about the Nolan Hickman starting spot. And for me, I mentioned that my initial starting lineup was the same as yours, Hickman, Bolton, Smith, Strawther, and Timme. I've waffled on whether I think it will be that or whether Hunter Salas will play his way into a starting role, which you also alluded to. In that situation, I would guess that the staff could shift Smith to be more of the traditional point guard, have Nolan Hickman come off the bench. There's a lot of options here. These guys are going to have to prove it. They don't get time to develop, like you said. You touched on this with Hickman earlier. How important, how critical is he to this team's success next season?
I mean, it's been a long time, like decades, since Gonzaga hasn't had a good starting point guard. Like they've had one of the luckiest runs you can imagine. And with Nembhard gone, it's somewhat a question because we don't know what Hickman is. Although the funny thing is Hickman is the most talented player on paper who joined Gonzaga out of high school. So Nigel Williams-Goss was a transfer, but he was also a 5-star guy. Hickman is the first 5-star point guard out of high school to join the program. So you would assume in his sophomore year, he's going to have a big year, and you have to hope that. If he does, this team's a legit national title contender. If not, you might see Malachi Smith take over that spot, and then Hunter Salas being an elite defender come in there, because another question would be is how good a defensive lineup is Timme, Strawther, Smith, Bolton, and then another guard. You may have to have Salas in there for defensive purposes in case that doesn't work out. So there's a lot of different ways that these guards can work minutes. Same with Dominick Harris. Maybe the team isn't that good defensively, so maybe you have to have lineups where both Harris and Salas is in there just to get stops. So it's going to be very interesting, but there's going to be a lot of eyes on Hickman, because if he handles it, then Strawther can play the 4. If he struggles in both, or Salas and Harris struggles, then you may actually have to push Strawther back to the 3, and then have Watson or Reid play the more 4 or 5. So Hickman can create a domino effect of what ideal lineups you can have, because you have to have the point guard situation handled. If that's not handled, nothing else works.
Absolutely. And I think it's so funny that, like, again, the pressure on these guys is like Hickman doesn't have a lot of leeway, even though he looks like the most traditional point guard on the roster. Like you said, he has to be significantly better than Anton Watson or Efton Reid, who do not play the same position as him. But in theory, he's competing with them for minutes because of the flexibility some of those other guys kind of offer. They can move some situations around. I'm very fascinated by the defense, because I do think that was part of the reason that I thought maybe Salas will start over Hickman, because Smith can play the point guard. And more importantly, Salas offers much more defensively. And right now, the starting lineup with Hickman and Bolton and Smith, if that's your 3-guard lineup and you're playing a team, I know Jamari Bouye is not in the conference anymore, but if you're playing a team with like a ball dominant guard like that, you need somebody who's going to match up with that guy. And the best player on Gonzaga's roster to do that, without a doubt in my mind, is Hunter Salas. The only other player who is competing with him is Dominick Harris. And we just haven't seen enough of him to know where he lines up defensively. But I kind of see situations where Gonzaga could roll out some more defensive heavy lineups like Efton Reid, Anton Watson, Hunter Salas, Dominick Harris, and insert any other guard here, where you have a ton of pressure. You could do full court, you can do all this stuff, and then you have lineups that are more offensively focused. Mark Few hasn't done a lot of like mass substitution stuff or big swings like that, but does that seem like something that could be in the cards this year, or do you think he's going to kind of play it a little bit more traditional and conservative like he's done in the past?
Yeah, I think he might in the non-conference be more traditional, because there's a lot of big games.
Yeah.
You have Texas, you have the PK5. Like it's difficult to experiment in there. And the way Gonzaga's, tournament resume works is that they have to do all the work in the non-conference.
Yeah.
This past year, when they beat Texas and UCLA, you almost could guarantee that they were going to be a 1 seed just because of those 2 wins alone. Right. So it's probably going to be put your best foot forward, probably go a 7-8 man lineup, do the best. And then once the conference play comes, then you can start to work out certain things like a defensive specific lineup or a shooting only lineup or some kind of versatility. Because when you go up against a team like San Francisco, who still has a lot of good guards, then you can have, Salas and Harris in there to see how that will work in case you want to stop a run or hold on to a lead. Right. Or if you go up against a team that has more bigs, maybe you can have a 2-big lineup and see how that works. So I think early on, you'll probably see the guys that look best during the fall practices sort of create, a set rotation, but then maybe you can work on some things and have something to, use when March comes. Because the one, I guess, criticism of Mark Few is that once the thing he has doesn't work in March, he's almost stuck with it. He can't, he doesn't make necessary adjustments to play someone out of nowhere. Like, in the game against Arkansas, Trey Wade was averaging around 10 minutes a game. There were games where he had DNP, coach's decision. Yeah. He ends up playing 32 minutes against, Chet Holmgren,
Yeah.
it ends up, being the best player on the court going 16 points. That's something that Eric Musselman does, which is guiding him to 2 straight Elite Eight appearances.
Yeah.
Can Mark Few can he sort of change that to where, hey, maybe he takes a risk and have Efton Reid and Timme play at the same time against bigger teams, or go 4 guards or a huge lineup. So.
No, it'll be interesting to see. I think Mark Few has not shown a lot of tendencies to do that, but if there was ever a year to experiment with some potentially unique lineups, I mean, this year's team has the depth, has the talent, and for the most part, the experience to do it. Obviously, there are some younger guys on this team, but a lot of guys who have some experience too. So I'll be interested to see if he's willing to move some things around and try some different stuff for what wouldn't be the first time in his career, but be the first time in a while that he's kind of experimenting with some new things. Tristan, thank you so much for coming on the show today, man. I really appreciate it. Do you want to let people know where they can find you and where they can find your work if they're interested in reading more of your lineup projections?
Yes, sir. You can find me on Twitter, hoopsnut351 online. You can also follow the Bustin' Brackets handle, as well as the site where we talk about Gonzaga, WCC, national noise. We're heading to the quiet part of offseason, not too many impact transfers left. So now we're going to, look at what teams have done, look at the rosters, who's done well and who has not. A whole lot to talk about because everyone's rosters changed by at least 50%. So you got to get the study in before we get ready for next season.
Well, Tristan, thank you again for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it. Folks, we got plenty of more great stuff coming your way this week. We got the return of Andy Locks, where a great listener submitted hot takes. So if you have a hot take about this team that you want me to talk about on the show, shoot it to me on Twitter or email me, andypatton013@gmail.com, and we can discuss that right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. All right, thank you all for listening, and go Zags.